Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, March 9th, 2026, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santamaria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, this show is and will always be 100% free to download, and the way that we keep it going and pay for all the things that we have to pay for is by relying on the support of individuals just like you. If you'd like to pledge your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com, that's patreon.com/talknerdy. This week's top patrons include Chuck Blell, David J.E. Smith, Daniel Lang, Mary Neva, David Compton, Brian Holden, Gabo J., Ulrika Hagman, Pasquale Gelati, and Joe Wilkinson. Thank you all so much. All right, let's get into it. This week I had a fascinating chat, and I just learned an awful lot. I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Robert J. Sampson. He's a sociologist and criminologist and the Woodford L. and Anne A. Flowers University professor at Harvard University, also the founding director of the Boston Area Research Initiative, and an affiliated research professor at the American Bar Foundation. But prior to that, he taught at the University of Chicago and the University of Illinois. He's won countless awards and held a lot of really esteemed positions. And a lot of his research stemmed from the Project on Human Development in Chicago neighborhoods. And we're going to talk about that at length because a lot of it informs his most recent book, which is called Marked by Time: How Social Change Has Transformed Crime and the Life Trajectories of Young Americans. So without any further ado, here he is, Dr. Robert J. Sampson. Well, Rob, thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here.
So when your book came across my desk, I've been doing this podcast now for 12 years, I think. And so I'm at a stage now where even though sometimes I hear about things and I seek things out, oftentimes I get books from most of the major publishing houses all the time sent to me, and just books upon books, and I'm often kind of giving them away to friends and family. Some of them are fastball down the middle for a science show. Some of them have absolutely nothing to do with the work we do here. But more recently, I've been getting into talking about social justice, and actually some of the listeners of the show might be like, you have a white man on the show? When's the last time that happened? But I make exceptions, especially when I think the content of the conversation is, just timely and incredibly important. So when your book came across my desk, I was like, oh, wow, this is a topic I don't think we've ever really talked about on the show, except sort of biting around the edges. And as a psychologist, this is, deeply interesting to me. So I want to get into first, kind of your academic path. That's what I usually like to do, to figure out how you became expert in these areas of inquiry. So I love interdisciplinary work. What would you say what department are you in even?
So I'm in the Department of Sociology, but
okay.
I've always considered myself a social scientist, right? Mm-hmm. So I have studied psychology, law, criminology, sociology, but I do come at things really from a sociological background, but in an interdisciplinary way.
Mm-hmm. And so has that been your course the whole time? Like, did you actually get sociology undergraduate and graduate degrees, get appointments in sociology departments, but you were always curious about these other things? Or did you jump around and have kind of a meandering path to get to?
Oh, definitely meandering. Actually, from the beginning. I mean, I grew up in upstate New York in a declining city, and there was all kinds of changes going around me that intellectually I didn't quite understand at the time. And I really didn't plan an academic background at all.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, most of my friends went into a very different path. And it really wasn't until I got into graduate school that I became hooked, as it were, on the ideas about crime and justice and social change. And in fact, the program that I went through as a graduate student, which was basically, to admit it, I mean, sort of random because I was just bumming around the country for a year after undergraduate, and I really just stumbled on this program an hour and a half from where I was living at the time. And it was an interdisciplinary department. It was actually an experiment that was started in the late 60s because crime was a hot topic. The
Mm-hmm.
increases in the 60s and the 70s, the turmoil that was hitting the country. And so they brought together psychologists, lawyers, sociologists, criminologists, you name it, into this graduate program. And this was at the State University of New York at Albany. And I was a New York kid through and through, undergraduate, public education. And I was deciding between that and Cornell and the sociology of science. Don't ask me why. It doesn't really add up. But once I got there, as I said, I just got hooked because crime is such a fascinating topic. And I do think you have to consider it from multiple angles. Although I had, I guess, in retrospect, I would say sort of a latent tendency to view things from a more macro or sociological perspective, as opposed to just focusing on the individual. Because I took a lot of, in fact, I think it was, yeah, sort of a joint psychology and sociology concentrator as an undergraduate.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, in so many ways, you can't have one without the other. Um, you cannot understand an individual perspective without understanding the culture that shaped that individual, and you really can't understand culture without understanding at least something about how the brain works and behavior relationships. I I got to tell you, it's so timely, and this is going to feel like untimely that I mentioned this, but my partner and I literally just watched We Own This City, the David Simon show on HBO,
That's great.
which is all about the Baltimore
Mhm.
corruption in the police department and a lot of kind of confusion around a fallen officer. And we talked a lot about The Wire and a lot of the kind of really fascinating ways that show showed these multiple angles that allowed you to start to develop a nuanced macro
Mhm.
view of criminology. I'm curious, do you feel like the media on the whole, and how do you even describe the media on the whole, has completely skewed our understanding of crime?
Well, yeah, in many ways, I think the media is always sort of hyper focused on crime. It seems like with all the news about crime, it's almost like it's always increasing. At least that is sort of the perception that people have, and part of that is fed by the news. Although, um, to give credit where credit is due, I think recently there has been more attention paid to the dramatic drops in crime since the
Mhm.
pandemic. But yeah, I think it's definitely skewed, and so are, I think, the political approaches to
Yeah.
crime because they're rooted, in my view, in sort of that particularistic view of crime being rooted in individual conditions, the who we are, as I put it in the book. And as you say, even though we recognize that the world is always changing, it's sort of a paradox because yes, we do, but on the other hand, we judge people outside of time
Yeah.
all the time. And so it's almost like a puzzle, actually, is the way I was thinking about it. And it goes back, actually, way back. It's almost a philosophical question. I quoted Heraclitus, the ancient Greek philosopher, at the beginning on the idea that no man, right, steps into the same river twice, where it's not the same river and it's not the same man. I mean,
Mhm.
individuals in society are changing together. And what we typically do is to split them apart. We look at individuals and tend to rest our assumptions and our theories on the qualities of the individuals, their families, and their immediate backgrounds.
Yeah.
Sociologists tend to focus more on the macro, but at the level of looking at, let's say, changes at the societal level over time, almost leaving out the individual. So it's that intersection or interaction of individuals' lives with societal change. That's what I really was after.
And I think that's why I can't help but go back to that paradigm that I guess, or maybe that insight that I developed when I was much younger, watching The Wire for the first time. And like, I felt so, um, I guess it was an awakening moment for me because it was one of the first times that there was a fictionalized, dramatized, entertaining experience that that touched on a lot of those different layers to
Yes.
our criminal justice system and to the human experience as it relates to crime. And I mean, I'm curious what your take is on maybe like the accuracy or the whether you saw that as something that was a boon for Americans to experience and learn from, or whether you were like, ooh, that set us back or something. But it did, to me at least, feel like a dramatized version of perhaps even some of the work that you do.
Yes, I love The Wire.
Oh, good. Okay.
In fact, I was turned on to it by my colleague here who is now retired, the great sociologist William Julius Wilson, who wrote The Truly Disadvantaged. He actually taught a course on The Wire here at Harvard,
Oh,
believe it or not.
nice.
So, yeah, it was important because it captured the times in a very powerful and poignant way. And it wasn't just the criminal justice system, right? It was the grinding poverty, it was the racism, it
Is the
was
politics.
Baltimore at that time. And I think,
Yeah.
in a way, I'm glad you brought it up. It sort of captures a framing of the book, because Chicago, at least certain parts of Chicago, were not all that different at the
Hmm.
time. I start out the book just using the example of two individuals from our study, Darnell and Andre, both pseudonyms, of course. And I talk about how Darnell was born in the mid 90s, and that was just after the peak or around the peak of violence in Chicago. Murder rates were hitting a really high level. The Chicago Trib was running a series on killing our children. A 7-year-old was shot and killed walking hand in hand with his mother to school. It just ripped the city apart. And I was there at the time, and everyone was just stunned. And you would have thought this kid is in trouble, right? But as soon as he was born, more or less, the world started changing dramatically. Violence plummeted. Arrest rates when he was in his adolescence were plummeting. Drug arrests, in particular, disorder arrests. And I compare that to another person. Andre was born around 1980, who was coming of age in the crack epidemic and hit his early adolescence during that very peak of violence in Chicago.
Yeah.
The key, though, is that they were both the same race. They both were raised by a single mother on welfare. They both lived in a high disadvantaged neighborhood. So analytically, that got me to thinking, and really that's the way I would sort of capture the analytic approach of the book. It's sort of a counterfactual approach, actually, which is to say, what if otherwise identical individuals were exposed to these radical environments that shaped their lives? In other words, they came of age in very distinct social worlds. And if that's the case, then it can't be that it's Darnell's poverty level or his family or even his self-control or temperament or personality. I try to separate those things out. And that's the idea of the interaction of the individual with social change. And I was able to do that given the design of the study, which I think is relatively unique in the social sciences.
Yeah, so talk to us about that because I know that this study is or at least your investigations on Chicago have been a large part of your career and a lot of your publications have come out of this. So talk to us about sort of the development of this study, how long you were doing it and what, the research questions were.
Yeah, feels like almost too long. It started actually in the late 80s, early 90s. I was a faculty member at the University of Chicago starting in the early 90s. Just a fabulous institution, and Chicago is a fabulous city. But as I noted earlier, at the time, it was really being roiled by these kinds of challenges when it came to the concentration of poverty, to violence, to children being killed, racist criminal justice behaviors, you name it. And so part of the rationale for the study was to try to make sense of all this. And this was a large effort that involved multiple institutions and multiple disciplines. So psychiatry, psychology, law. It was really started out as a study group funded by the MacArthur Foundation, which then built up into this larger study. To make a long story short, we started data collection after a lot of planning in the mid 90s and enrolled
Mhm.
over 6,000 children and their caretakers or parents. But the key analytic piece of that, which differed from most other studies, is that we created what's known as a sequential cohort design, but put into plainer English, we enrolled multiple age cohorts, starting with infants. So we enrolled women that were in their pregnancy or early uh, childhood, let's say up to about 6 months or so on average, spaced out every 3 years up to 18 years old. So, in other words, we had multiple cohorts, 0 to 18, and then we followed each cohort in detail over the same period of time, over, well, now it's been almost 30 years. Now, we didn't follow every child. We couldn't afford to do so
Of
because
course.
it was such a large scale study. So we sampled as we went into the uh, further data collection. But it was original data collection on these children that were coming age of, in terms of different times. So you can imagine someone turning 15, for example, in 1995 versus 2005. And we didn't
Mhm.
know, I would emphasize this. At the time, we did not envision, who could have known, right? It's the whole point. You can't predict the future, that there would be these vast social changes. So it wasn't really until recently that we could piece this all together.
Did you anticipate that you would be collecting data for this long? Did
Absolutely
you
not.
go into it? Like, how long did you think this kind of longitudinal study would last?
Well, 4 or 5, 6 years. I mean, it's really
Mhm.
hard. And as I said, let me just give you an example. So there were multiple investigators, principal investigators. At one point, we hired something like 120 people were on staff, rented a building in Chicago. We were collecting data. We hired survey firms. It was just a huge operation. And it was exhausting, frankly. And it was designed to last, again, about 3 waves of data, which is 5 to 6 years. And then it kind of went on hiatus for a bit. And it wasn't
Mhm.
until about 2012 that I came back to it with fresh eyes. And especially given the changes that had ensued over that period of time, the Great Recession had happened a few years earlier. So, along with another colleague, we sought funding and said, wouldn't it be a great idea if we went back to these kids? It's a unique design. Let's see where they are today. And that was hard too, because when you go back and try to find kids after that many years, it's a challenge. But we did that, and then we interviewed them again, and then we matched them up with different kinds of records in terms of mortality and crime, childhood exposure to lead, and so forth. And so it was not anticipated, to be honest. And in fact, it's sort of kind of a paradox in the sense of expectations, because the original design, statisticians thought, well, this is cool. We have kids from 0 to 18. In 6 years, we can look at the life course from age 0 to approximately 25. We'll just stitch it together. But
Mhm.
that assumes that the world didn't change, right? So
Right.
it
Mhm.
it was like it was an eye opener, but it took a while really to envision all that. And so, yeah, that's why I've been working on it for so long.
I mean, it's incredible. Is the sort of overarching approach then, or at least was it at the time? Obviously, it's been changing as you've analyzed data and you've started to ask new questions. But was the real question kind of which variables matter when it comes to, I guess, myriad outcomes for these kids living in Chicago? Like
Yes.
which
So,
variables affect which outcomes?
yes. So I think the predominant view
Hmm.
of the study was, well, this will allow us to look at the different risk factors, if I can put it that way. The risk factor paradigm is quite prominent in the social sciences, and it looks at things like individual family structure, poverty, the personality of the child, and so forth. And
Hmm.
that's important. And in fact, if you go back earlier in my career, I started out with a longitudinal life course study of kids here in Boston that were born in another really interesting historical era, mainly the Depression era of the
Mm.
United States, that were born here in Boston. And we ended up following them for a very long time too. But they were from the same cohort. And
Hmm.
my research was focused on things like family structure and family supervision. And as they got older, looking at things like schooling, work, employment, marriage as a turning point in the life course. We even looked at military service as a turning point for crime. In other words, does getting married lead to a drop in crime, or does going into the military lead to a drop in crime or an increase? So it was
Hmm.
that sort of focus, and that's, I think, a large part of focus of life course research, psychological research, developmental research. And I'm not criticizing that at all. I mean, damn, I've done
Yeah,
it, but yeah,
in
I
and
was
of
like, but wait
itself,
a
I
minute.
mean, yeah, it sounds like nearly impossible even to do a study like that. And then with the realization that, you know, the cleaner the study, right? The cleaner the results very often. And I see this all the time in the sciences when we talk about gold standard research or we talk about, a kind of outcome studies that set the standard for how policy is spoken about. But very often I worry, at least I see this in psychology quite a lot. The reason, for example, that CBT is the gold standard treatment is because it's easy to test.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? It's like, of course, things that are easier to do in the lab and easier to show a significant, outcome are going to be the things that are then integrated more readily into treatment or into policy. But the problem is that's not really, um, effectiveness research. Like, that's not how
Yeah.
the world works. And once you actually start to look at the variables that fundamentally, all of those moderating and mediating variables that fundamentally change outcomes, and it starts to get really, really messy, I think a lot of people are like, okay, that's above my pay grade. And that's why we
Yeah.
don't see that kind of research very often.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. In the sort of the randomized clinical trials, experimental paradigm is dominant in terms of policy. There's a lot to be said for it. As you
Mhm.
know, it
Sure.
allows for sort of causal identification of a particular intervention. But if you think about it, it's like, okay, there's all these individualized interventions, but it's assuming kind of a static world, right?
Yes.
And to the extent that the world is changing, then we may not be making the right inferences. I mean, take the Perry Preschool project, which was a famous experiment and a wonderful one, but those kids came of age in a very particular world. I think a lot of the assumptions that we make in these studies are problematic because there's temporal heterogeneity. Like, a lot of people worry about experiments. Well, this worked in Baltimore. Will it work in Chicago? That's an important question. But I'm more interested in, well, will it work tomorrow?
Right.
And
This worked in
that's a
like
different
Obama's
thing.
America. Will it work in Trump's America? Or this
Exactly.
work?
So
Yeah. And
it's shifting the question. I don't want to, and I do not in any way denigrate those approaches. I'm asking a different kind of question. I'm sort of flipping the script, and it even
mhm.
has to do with interventions again at the individual level. Let's take a lot of approaches nowadays are looking at sort of behavioral interventions and trying to get people to think slower. And we talk about self control. And I think that's all well and fine. And in fact, in my data, I show that kids with low self control are much more likely to be arrested. But we can ask a different question and say, well, what is the manifestation of something like low self control in the future when we compare different birth cohorts? When we do that, what I found was that the high self control kids of one cohort, the earlier cohorts from the 80s, had essentially the same arrest rates as the low self control kids of the later cohort. So, in other words, their rates of crime were, in a sense, equated over time, which means that the manifestations or the predictions that we might make about kids with low self-control are dependent on the historical context. To me, that's just a different way of thinking. It's not to say it's unimportant as a construct, but
it's not the whole truth.
It's
and
not
I
only
think
the whole truth, it's fundamentally different. I mean, let's look at today. I mean, violence is just dropping dramatically. Is that because, self-control has changed that much? I don't think so.
I would, and I would venture to guess that actually the sort of quick attention economy that most people are living in is affecting our self-control in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
I wonder if today people are much less capable of sitting quietly with their own thoughts, of regulating their emotions than they were historically when they didn't have a million distractions at their fingertips.
That's right. It could even be that there's massively less self-control, but yet crime is going down.
Crime is going down.
It's just another point that you can't go from the individual level to make predictions at the societal level in a clean and neat way. And so that's what the book is trying to do. It's just, it's like a laser focus on one particular idea, which I happen to think is important. It's not to throw out that other stuff, but hey, we really need to zero in on it.
Mm-hmm. And so that's why, the book is called Marked by Time, right? How societal change has transformed crime and the life trajectories of young Americans. And so when you do studies like this, you can look at your findings and you can say, oh, it's so interesting. At this time, these people had these outcomes. And at that time, those people had those outcomes. But what's sometimes hard with this kind of research, and I think what a lot of people are like champing at the bit to understand, is why? Like, what is the actual driving variable underneath? It's one thing to say, this is what we see. Mm-hmm. It's another thing to make inferences about why we see that. And so I'm really curious how you connect those dots, not just for the reader in the book, but, in all of the publications that you've been engaged with and all of the, academic scholarship that you've been engaged with throughout this study. Are you able to sort of comfortably say, we think this is why these are some of the outcomes that we found?
I think we can make some reasonable arguments, and that's what I try to do, because you're absolutely right. If you're going to make the argument that when we are is as important as who we are, and that's exactly what I do, we need to know something about the when. And so we can't do an experiment. And that goes back to your earlier point, particularly when it comes to history, when it comes to social change. So you have to work differently. And, to put it in simple terms, what I do is to try to work like a detective and look at the different things that were changing over this period of time, but importantly, at distinct ages that are important for child development. So in other words, when each of these cohorts, when they were turning, let's say, early adolescence or 18 or early adulthood, what was going on in society at the time. And I spent an entire chapter looking at that more macro level change and then integrating it with the individual change. And we can rule out certain things, right? So I look at factors like, well, was it police force size? I mean, there's a lot of literature saying, well, we need more police or police per capita. Well, it turns out that was relatively flat across the entire period. So logically, that can't explain the changes. Drug use, for example, We also looked at patterns, and again, relatively flat. I mean, there's fluctuations, they go up and down, but the line of drug use just does not align with drug arrests, which dropped almost 90%. Think about that. So the Andres of the world, kids who were born in the early 80s, they were unlucky in a dramatic way, whereas the other or later cohorts had a totally different experience. So, or, smoking a joint on the street or roughing it up, that's what kids do. Totally different. And so it's not so much driven by that behavior of drug use, it was driven by policing policy changes. Similarly, I looked at employment and poverty, and those things can't explain it. And I basically argue that there's sort of two higher order factors, and then I can break it down a little bit, but about half, I mean, this is not an exact decomposition, but about half is due to policing changes. So sort of the collapse of warrior policing in Chicago, that is to say, the decline in drug arrests, decline in public disorder arrests, that combined with, I'd say, over time, I mean, it gets not linear. There was stop and frisk, and there were some fluctuations, but the trends were toward a less aggressive policing overall, and I would argue, I think, better policing, better data, more community-oriented policing. So that's sort of the policy change when it comes to policing. But then there's the broad-scale social changes, I think, that you might have been getting at. And I sort of lump them into 4 or 5 buckets. One is that sort of larger urban revitalization that took place throughout America. Cities changed really quite dramatically in terms of improvement. There was increases in immigration, which counterintuitively, I argue, may have led to reductions in vacancy and even reductions in crime rates. That was an important sort of social change.
I think that's only counterintuitive in today's America.
Oh, yes, I know.
I think historically, people would expect that.
Yes, indeed. That's a new threat, if you will, because the ICE, let's say, aggressive interventions in places like Minneapolis, to me, that's replaying the script of
100%.
Rampant immigrant criminality. I looked back, I actually wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in 2006, and at that time there was this whole kind of panic about immigrant criminality, and there was legislation that was being put forth, and I wrote an op-ed. This was based on an article from this Chicago study saying, well, wait a minute, folks, first-generation immigrants in our study have lower rates of violence by quite a bit. And if you look at the macro level trends, immigration was going up as crime was going down. So again, in that detective-like fashion, you can say, well, this argument just isn't holding water. So that's another example of how you can piece together what the mechanisms are.
Yeah, so more immigration in these cities, as you mentioned before, kind of went hand in hand with revitalization, with jobs being filled, with vacancies being filled, with more community engagement. And all of these things are mechanisms that can help drive down crime.
Community engagement, for sure. I agree with that. In fact, there's good evidence from other scholars that increases in community-based organizations, especially for young people, nonprofits, for example, that support kids and after-school programs and employment and so forth, were associated with the drop in crime. This was based on a very sophisticated study. In other words, communities were fighting back. I'll put it that way. When crime was going up, and they had an effect on reducing crime. So that's another mechanism that I talk about in the book in terms of what we need to do as a society. It's not all about policing. In fact, my entire career really has been an argument that informal social controls and community-based social controls are central. People are not committing crime because there's a police officer on the block, because there's usually not. Right? They're tied to society.
Yeah, and
in other
also
ways.
putting a police officer on the block is not the only deterrent to crime. It's like it's both.
Absolutely.
It's
Community
such a
deterrence,
silly
like,
idea.
yeah, the grandmother on the corner who yells at the kids who are, making a ruckus, that's a form of social control. And I think we underplay that. And we underplay other things like clean environments, the
Mhm.
actually going to experiments. There's really good evidence from researchers at Penn and other places that did these really neat randomized trials where they cleaned up vacant lots. And you would think, well, what the hell does that have to do with crime? Well, if you think about it, when you have a cleaner, safer, greener, more appealing environment, then people venture out into those spaces that they were formerly fearful of. Then they socially interact with one another. And then there's more eyes on the street, as the great urbanist
Yeah.
Jane Jacobs would have put it. And that is another mechanism that leads to lower crime. So
Well, and they also feel
environmental policy,
proud, they
yeah,
feel proud of their neighborhoods and
sure.
they engage in a way that is protective. When you have ownership over something, when it doesn't feel like that's for others, I think that can have a massive impact. And, I've long believed, and again, this is a psychological perspective because I am a psychologist, but I think it's informed by these larger social forces. I worry sometimes that when we look, and I'm taking this on a little tangent, but I want to come back to these 5 things that you mentioned. I worry sometimes that when we look at kind of criminal behavior, we moralize. It's just a tendency that we do as a culture. And like you said, we put the onus on the individual, and we often want things to be simple and easy and say that person did that thing because that person is bad, or because that person is evil, or because that person, is lacking a conscience. But I it is very hard for me to think in those parameters, and I've long believed that when people engage in activity that is like antisocial or, you know, deemed to be criminal, it's very often done out of a feeling of, let's call it desperation, that
Yeah.
people have a need, whether we're talking about murder rates as related to, drug activity, whether we're talking about grand theft, whether we're talking about all these different types of things, rape, I'm not saying that people don't do bad things. Of course, a lot of people do bad things. But when you get into the psychology, it's a very small percentage of people who actually have antisocial personality disorder, who actually are sort of have psychopathy. I think most people commit crimes because they feel like that was the best path they could take at that time.
That's right. And that has a lot to do with the context at the time. I
Mhm.
think it is true that we typically view character as the sort of immutable core of our personality that defines who we are. And yeah, it has a distinctly moral dimension. If you even go back to some of the great philosophical texts, you'll see references to character being defined as a criminal act or a criminal
Yeah.
record. And moreover, that sense of the criminal character is rooted in this idea of a stable propensity. And I spent a lot of time in the book actually on theories of propensity and character, and show that even though we're not supposed to, like in the legal system, for example, character is smuggled in really at pretty much every stage of the criminal justice system, whether it's a cop on the
Totally.
street assuming that sort of moral character of an individual based on their demeanor or looks or dress or whatever, to sentencing decisions. It's all wrapped
Mhm.
up with this idea that, well, you have a criminal record, you're a criminal. But as we've been talking, hopefully, the listener can see that, well, that criminal record has history baked into it. And therefore, if you're making
Absolutely.
decisions based on that, then you're sort of falling into a trap. It's actually what I call the character trap. Because if, let's say, we deny someone bail, we deny someone a job because of a criminal record, or an apartment based on a credential check, then in a sense we're blocking the very opportunities, the very social ties that prevent crime in the first place. So it's a vicious cycle that's self-reinforcing, that's
Yeah.
counterproductive, hence the
It's a
character
negative
graph.
feedback loop that I
Yep,
think
exactly.
drives inequality. And, I often will call that criminalizing poverty, but that probably isn't a robust enough description because it's not, as you've mentioned so well here, it's not just about poverty. We criminalize social standing and opportunity or lack of opportunity. And what ends up happening is that you can't then extricate racism. You can't then extricate classism. These very foundational views that were uh, baked in, not just baked in, but they were the engine for like eugenics policy early on. I shouldn't even say early; it wasn't that long ago. Um, that is really what we are talking about. Like when we looked at early eugenics literature and sort of political stances here in the U.S., and then of course exporting out to even places like Nazi Germany, the argument was one that most people could get behind. It was we want healthy, clean babies, and we
Yep.
want streets that are free of crime. And people were like, "That's great. We want that too. How are we going to achieve it?" Well, these people over here tend to be criminals, so they shouldn't reproduce. They shouldn't have access to these services and blah blah blah. Those people over there are of a good ilk, right? Like they're the right kinds of people to be involved in society. I mean, and that just pervades everything.
Oh, it does. And I think if you look at it historically, different groups have come into that. I mean, if you look at immigrant groups in the earlier part of the 20th century, like here in Boston, the Irish and Italian immigrants were badly mistreated by the police, for example. Racism in terms of the criminal justice system, with regard to African Americans, the same kind of thing, especially in the era of rising mass incarceration. It was almost as if blackness was equated with criminality. And that's another kind of way that people are making these links or assumed links with either a categorical group identity, let's say whether it's race or could be poverty, low income individuals of all races, or the sort of more psychological view, which is, well, these are just, low moral, antisocial, low self control kids that are kind of written off, to be honest. I mean, the whole idea of antisocial or psychopathy, or let's not forget the images that are constantly conjured up, right? The super predators. I mean, that whole idea, you can't really
Yeah.
get to that unless you have a deeply sort of individualized view of the immorality of
Hmm.
individual offenders.
And of course, that protects, I think, the consciousness of those who have a privileged position in society, of those who are the ones who are developing policy and who have their finger on the social control buttons, because it says, well, that I'm never going to be that. I'm not built that way. That person is built that way, and they're going to constantly be engaging in this kind of stuff, and maybe we can rehab them a little and do some things that keep them from being the worst of the worst, but ultimately that's just how they are. But me over here, I could never be that. And it's like, it's like the old adage, like all of us are like a bad week away from homelessness. We are not a good week away from billionaire status. We just
Yeah,
aren't,
yeah,
like,
right. There, for the grace of God, go I. But I think that's right, and you can think about it in this context as, again, that sort of historical era is an important piece of that. Like you say,
oh,
I mean, people that are
100%.
making policies, they just have a hard time imagining what it would have been like to be a kid, for example, in Baltimore during the, if, let's assume The Wire is capturing it in an accurate way during those
Mhm.
times, or on the south side of Chicago in 1993 when violence was just in epidemic levels, or Washington D.C., or any number of cities in the United States.
And it's so important, this template that you mention, or this understanding of this temporal and dynamic temporal experience, because I find myself, I mean, I'm a human being and I fall into these traps too. I was born in 1983. I grew up in Texas, lived in New York, now I've been in LA for quite some time. I think about the formative experiences I had. I think about Columbine when I was in high school. I think about 9/11 when my first year of college. I think about, where I was in life when all these big things happened. And I think about what the streets of the different towns that I spent time in looked like. I think about how The Wire is relevant to me because that was my youth. No, I didn't grow up in Boston, and I didn't experience the things that those kids experience, but that was the time that I was a child, And so when I think about policy, I can't help but view it through the lens of somebody who was born in 1983. Whereas some of the people who are in power now are viewing it through a lens of people who lived during, post-war boom, or through a lens of wherever they came from. And it's hard for any of us to imagine what sort of like Trump's Gilead would look like for women, for example.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It's really tough to do because that's not our experience.
That's right. It's hard to get out of that. In fact, there's a venerable tradition in the social sciences that speaks exactly to that I talk about in the book. I mean, you go back, actually, Karl Mannheim was a great sociologist, wrote about generations and collective memories, and he and others talk about sort of critical ages, and roughly ages 18 to 25. It's interesting you mentioned when things happen that sort of are seared into your memory. This is true across all ages. There's fascinating work that shows, for example, if you ask people even up till 80 years of age, everyone tends to mention events that happened within the same age range. So
yeah, they also listen to music from that era too.
Oh yeah, music, sure.
Yeah.
There's want to get into it. Let's talk music.
Yeah.
No, it's true, and so those formative years, the sort of coming of age, when you link that to that specific historical context, it's not even just one thing. That's why I think the sort of experimental logic goes awry, because it's a constellation of factors that were happening when you were, let's say, in late high school or in the college years. And it's that interaction of that age with those social changes. And we can say what they were, and we can make, as I try to do in the book, reasonable assumptions about, well, this is more important than that. But there is no one magic bullet factor, just like there is not in individual. And the real challenge, again, as I see it, is to try to piece together the individual, the macro. And it's just really damn hard to do.
Absolutely. I mean, as you mentioned, a perfect example, I mentioned Columbine, I mentioned 9/11. When I was in early grad school, I was, canvassing for Obama. I was, and all of these things feel like formative experiences for me personally, but in the culture, just the massive change that happened, for example, when we had the Obama era, the massive societal change, the amount of hope, but then what policy changes were actually, enacted and which ones weren't. We go back to those big things that you identified in the book, and I want to make sure that we come back to them. One of the things that you mentioned was this change in policing from a more sort of aggressive, militarized, overtly racist and like kind of lack of probable cause style policing to more community building, and maybe, I shouldn't say back to, but at least an integration of protect and serve. But how much of that is really just tied to the fact that we lost the drug war, and people started to recognize this is, as long as there's a war on drugs, that means we're at war with our own citizens. And these outcomes that we're seeing here, this high crime, this, not just high crime, but like high murder rates, right? Like actual detriment to public health. How much of that was just tied to a sort of collective understanding that this concept of the drug war and this framing of how we are going to police is it's just not working.
Yeah, I think that's an important part of it. I think there was a recognition, not across the board, but
Right. Not across the board.
importantly, in a lot of places, that was a mistake,
Hmm.
and that we started to backtrack on that. Not at the same pace in every city. And New York
Yeah.
City, for example, had stop and frisk at a really insane level into the like 2010 and so forth, uh, which we didn't see so much in Chicago, but that
Hmm.
dropped there eventually too. And so, yes, I think policing improved, but I wouldn't put all my eggs in that basket in the following sense: that one of the key lessons I think in the book is that social change, right, it's not linear,
Hmm.
and things can change on a dime. And what I worry about is the fact that by conjuring up these images from the past, we often revert back to these mistakes. Right, we're fighting the last war. So, I mean, the ICE invasion, really, in
Yeah. Yeah.
Minneapolis, I think is really problematic. I mean, it's obviously problematic in terms of the violence, but in terms of leading to more mistrust and alienation, particularly of youth, with
A hundred
regard to the criminal
percent.
justice system, I see a setback here, and that's really worrisome because to the extent you have distrust in the police, then people don't report crimes to the police, which then is another kind of vicious cycle, which can lead to more crime. And what's interesting is that even police chiefs, or at least many police chiefs, are against what's happening there because they feel like there were gains made. There was more
Hmm.
trust in the communities that's now being undermined. So it's not guaranteed that crime's going to continue to go down, or well, who knows what's going to happen.
Oh, I think it's
That
almost guaranteed that it's going to go up
yeah,
based
and
on, I mean,
yeah, so
that's my big concern about, because this, as you mentioned, there's one thing when you look at these sort of slow, steady changes over time and a big longitudinal study like this that allows you to have multiple cohorts, you can see nuanced changes even if things are happening slowly, but it's always going to be punctuated with these massive dramatic shifts that occur when, there's an authoritarian regime, or that occur when there's like a massive recession, or some sort of horrific natural disaster, a pandemic, for example. Those
yeah,
things
the
don't happen
pandemic hit
slowly.
exactly. That hit us all right, with caught everyone unaware. And the youngest cohort, actually, in the book that I study, was lucky in most ways in terms of arrests and many forms of violence. But when they were in their late teens, early adulthood, they were sort of bumping up against that chaos
Yeah.
of the pandemic and George Floyd and the unrest, spike in gun violence. And so, in certain respects, they were unlucky. And it
Hmm.
goes back to that: what happens when you're 18 to 25? And so that sort of leads to that imprint in terms of how people are experiencing the world. So, going back to, let's say, Minneapolis, the youth in particular, I think, are going to be the most affected by that. Not limited to that group, but I think that's the real worry about the kinds of the gains that have been made and the setbacks that we're seeing. So hopefully, we can get back on track. And the good news is that violence is down pretty dramatically. Most crimes are down. So it is almost as if we're sort of reverting back to the pre-pandemic era, that was this blip, a massive
Hmm.
blip, in terms of this rupture in the social structure, which led to all kinds of alienation, to increases in violence and accidents, sort of a multitude of factors, which are now, for the most part, tending to recede. So that's why we need to take both the long view, but also look at these punctuated large events
Yeah.
like the pandemic, like 9/11, like the Great Recession, like the drug war. And again, that's what I do. And in fact, one of the graphs in the book, I try to piece together all the major events, including political administrations and changes in that.
Yeah. Yeah. I I've long believed that, sort of because of the, in this, again, back to a psychological framing, because of the way that we perceive time and the way that we perceive the time that existed before us and the time that may exist after us, I think there's a tendency, almost like a psychological bias, to maximize the impact of history, of, oh, that happened back then and things were really different then. Things were really weird. That was a really intense thing. But right now, this is just my life. And I think that that framing shift of we are living in history.
Mhm.
All of these things that we are experiencing are shaping outcomes for, as you mentioned, months, years, decades, generations to come. The children who are experiencing the social pressures or, this myriad kind of variables right now, that's going to affect how they govern in the future, or how they vote, or how they engage with their neighbors. And so that temporal component of it, not only is it so important to look at it sort of academically, sort of cognitively, it's also, I think, important to constantly relate ourselves back to it. We are not somehow separate from time.
That's absolutely right. And that's, in a way, if you think about projecting into the future, another advantage of sort of cohort way of thinking. It's not only that kids are differentiated by these social changes at the time, but they are going to then age, right, into later years with those experiences formative in their minds, and all the events that shape where they are will influence future policy. And that's what we
Mhm.
think of in terms of cohort replacement. And so what
Mhm.
about the kids that are 18 to 25 now when they are in positions of policy when they're 40, or the people that are in positions of power now? I think that's a really central insight of the
Mm.
cohort way of thinking that really tells us what's going to, or at least the important features for the future. And part of the problem here, too, is that we really have trouble, I think, updating our mental models of the world. It's sort of almost
Absolutely.
like a cognitive bias, another way
Yeah.
of kind of getting to what you were saying. That's what I think of it as, that we tend to, again, revert back to that imprint in our brains, really,
Yeah,
of
it's an
those
anchor
formative
point for us.
experiences.
So
Yeah, it's natural. We all
everything.
do it.
Totally. So everything we experience, yes, I am alive today in 2026, but everything is being compared to those, sort of late teenage years, or whatever the experiences you were having at that time. Whether I felt safer then than I do now, oh, things have gotten worse, or whether I felt less safe then, oh, things are more stable in life. Like we're always anchoring back to that sort of inflection point in our lives. And I see it, I guess I've gained insight into this, and that's why this conversation is so exciting for me, because you're kind of sharing this evidence-based um, description of something that I feel like lately, as I'm a psychotherapist, I'm a clinical psychologist in a cancer center, which means that I work primarily with gerontological patients, although I do see some pediatric patients and some kind of, patients in middle age who gets cancer. We all get cancer the older we get. That's sort of the way life works. And I just have this beautiful opportunity to get in, to do deep therapy with people who have lived really long, rich lives. And it's fascinating learning about their perspectives. Somebody whose anchor point was in, 1968, and that was their formative year. Or somebody whose anchor point, it's fascinating to see their worldview and their perspective throughout these different, I guess you could call them cohorts as well.
Well, they are.
Um,
Yeah. And
yeah,
you're really
and
sort
we
of
don't do that
able to,
enough.
yeah, to sort of get into their sense of time and how
Yeah.
it's experienced across these different ages. And going back to sort of the earlier conversations, that's how a lot of research is problematic, because if you just look at one cohort, basically your aging and the societal changes that are happening are simultaneous. So they're
Mhm.
right,
So they're
they're
happening
going
in the
on
background.
together.
You
So
don't notice it. Yeah.
yeah, and so therefore disentangling them, that's really the key. So you
Mhm.
need to separate that out, and that's why looking at the different cohorts at these different points, even though they're the same ages at different historical points, it's like another way of seeing the world. That's how I think of it.
Yeah, I think it is. And it reminds me of, it's a way that you've probably heard this before, but a lot of, at least academics in psychology and probably in sociology too, will often refer to things like patriarchy or things like sort of these background social pressures that really affect literally everything, but you don't notice them because we often will say it's the water we swim in.
Yep.
And
Yeah,
when
I'm
you're
glad you
swimming
said
in
that
water,
because
yeah,
yeah,
you
it's like
don't notice it.
yep. That's how I feel about these changes. It's like the air we breathe. It's like, yeah, it's
Yeah.
okay. It's we all know it's changing, but I'm just going to go on acting the way that I normally
Mhm.
do, and again, judge people outside of the time.
Right, right. And we just we cannot do that. And I think this sort of a last point that I think is important to bring up. We do have to judge people in time, and I think historians do a brilliant job of that, but sometimes I think there's an apologetic way that we judge individuals based on time. Like we can also take it too far. And I will often see this when I talk to older adults in my life who are sort of apologizing for bad behavior of, let's say, gross men or bad behavior of grandparents who aren't, understanding progressive movements of their kids. And they'll say, "Oh, but they're from a different era," and and I'm like, "Yeah, but it was still bad then." Like racism was still bad even when it was acceptable in the public to be overtly racist. And there were always people in those cohorts who weren't and who were
That's right.
fighting against it and who had, a perspective that maybe wasn't normative, but now looking back on the sort of moral arc of history, we see was just. And I think we have to remember that as well.
Yeah, I
We are
agree. And
products of our time, but
yep.
we are not victims of our time.
No, there's another way to think about it is that there's a lot of heterogeneity within the cohort. So absolutely,
Yeah, yeah.
it's just a way of capturing the historical experiences that each cohort is growing up with. But, and I say this in the book, I mean, in no way am I arguing against individual responsibility
Right.
or even arguing against the idea of punishment. It's more that, well, we have to place it in context. And
Mhm.
these are some of the characteristics we have to take into account. And that has pragmatic implications, like, for example, the drug war. We now know that in large part that was a mistake. So, commuting the sentences, for example, of people who were locked up for smoking marijuana when you can walk into a marijuana store. I have one, 4 blocks from my house. It's like
Yeah.
a weird experience. Like, wait a minute, you can just go in and buy pot, but there's people in prison for
Still
doing the
today,
same
you're
thing
right.
at an
Yeah.
earlier point. So we
Yep.
can
Yep.
say, well, in that case, that's a kind of cohort reparations philosophy. But it's not to
Yeah.
say that every individual commits crime we let off. No, that's just crazy talk.
Yeah. 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 I think it's the gray, it's the nuance. And I think these kinds of conversations help us spend more time in there and help us with our comfort level in the nuance, in the gray, in the uncertainty.
And I
Because
think learning
again,
too that we just can't predict very well. At the
yeah, that's for
fundamental
sure.
level, right? That at the end of the day, and that's another thing I show is that when you use the data from the older cohorts and you predict the younger cohorts' outcomes, we do a poor job. And to me,
Yeah.
that's just a clean finding that again goes to the point that we have to take these things into account because we're just making large errors.
Mhm. Yeah. Oh gosh, I hate that I have a doctor's appointment I have to get to right now, and you have a life that you have to lead too. But I
Yeah, but
mean,
it's fun to talk about. I think I want your job, right? You read books and talk to people about
I
it.
know
It's
it's so great.
great.
And I mean, I really, really hope that the folks listening today, pick up this book and dig into this, even if it is even if Chicago feels far from your consciousness, it's a slice of something that expands your ability to then shift your frame and shift your paradigm. Like I do think that this kind of work can be paradigm shifting work because it can change the way that people engage and think about their place in society and think about how they became who they are, why the people around them are the way they are. I mean, this right here is an empathy machine. I really think it's important for our development as responsible citizens to expand our thinking in this way. And the work that you've done, really, these are the tools that we need to improve empathy. And so I'm grateful for that, and I'm grateful for you spending the time with us to talk about the book. Tell me, is there like a name to the ongoing study? Like, if people want to read more about it beyond the book, what would they kind of search for?
Well, the study is called the Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods. That's what started in the mid 90s, and
Mm-hmm.
it's still ongoing. We're planning to do more work, crazy as it sounds. And so there's a website for the project that can be found on my website. It's devoted solely not just to my work, but to all the work that the project has been involved with over the years. So if people search on Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods
Mm-hmm.
on the Harvard website, they should be able to find it. And we hope to keep going because there's a lot of change surely to come that we want to capture.
And obviously, your previous book was but Great American City, Chicago and the Enduring Neighborhood Effect. And this book is called Marked by Time: How Societal Change Has Transformed Crime and the Life Trajectories of Young Americans, by Dr. Robert J. Sampson. Rob, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for speaking with me. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.